This discussion will concentrate on a very complex history of endless negotiations during the 1940s, in which the British government, the Congress, the British Indian government, the Muslim League, all these different actors were involved. The discussion continued around questions concerning Indian political aspirations, further constitutional reforms, what the British described as the Indian problem.
Sir, what is meant by this Indian problem?
The Indian problem concerns a certain perception among the British officials about how to devolve power in India, keeping the competing political parties happy and at the same time retaining India's unity. So the Indian problem is a problem of blending freedom with unity. You are now familiar with the history of how the Unitarian nationalism had been weakened progressively by separatist tendencies in the course of the early 20th century. So when the British officials or the statesmen were actually trying to introduce constitutional changes in India, they were required to consider the problem posed by this kind of disunity, because otherwise the whole question of India's unity was likely to be undermined by the mutual acrimony of different interest groups, sectarian groups in Indian society. When we look at this high politics of constitution making, the varied kinds of proposals that emanated in the course of the 1940s, from Cripps proposals to the Cabinet Mission Plan, roughly covering the period between 1942 and 1946, we have to consider this perennial problem among officials concerning a reconciliation between freedom and unity. The responsible government in the provinces, for all practical purposes, failed to work. The Congress ministries constantly complained about limitations of powers. They complained about the way power remained concentrated in the hands of the governor, emergency powers, extraordinary powers. They complained about inadequate finance which they needed in order to carry out their reformist program. So there was an endemic complaint by Congress ministries particularly about the way the Act of 1935 had not provided them with responsible government. On the contrary, the promises that they had made to the people were not maintainable with the limitation of powers. So the constitutional negotiations of the 1940s required to be studied in the backdrop of a certain Congress distrust about the intentions of the British, dissatisfaction with the way the particular system was actually working after the Congress decided to form ministries in several provinces. It is at this juncture, towards the close of the 1930s, in 1939, the war intervened and changed the complexion of the situation so remarkably that there was an urgency on the part of the British government to conciliate Indian public opinion. The war was posing such a great problem for them. They needed Indian participation. And in order to ensure this participation, the British had to hold out promises of further devolution of power in future, independence at a foreseeable future date. And the opinions, however, both on the Indian side and on the British side, were divided. There was a feeling that due to the war, the British needed to work out some kind of a strategy to make the position in India secure. You could secure the position in India by adopting a military strategy, by strengthening your military power, your strategic power, by introducing strong measures in order to contain any kind of opposition that might unsettle their strategic position. But you could also adopt, as some of these British statesmen suggested, a different strategy of integrating Indians in the British attempt to contain the Axis powers internationally. And between those who suggested the continuance of the military strategy and others who felt that a different kind of conciliatory measure was needed, there were serious ideological differences. You have on the one hand the conservative diehards, men like Winston Churchill, for example, who would not be willing to foresee in the foreseeable future any devolution of power or any measure of self-government for India, let alone dominion status. He would be willing to associate Indians, but only in a kind of a consultative capacity in strengthening the defense measures of the empire. But there would be a man like Stafford Cripps, for example, a socialist, friendly towards Indian political leadership, had a certain identity of opinion and perception with people like Jawaharlal Nehru or Krishna Menon. Cripps has been campaigning for some time in favor of introducing some kind of colonial self-government, at times going to the extent of suggesting complete independence for India. Of course, retaining the provision for independent India to join the British Commonwealth. You have, on the British side, a clear ideological divide regarding the resolution of the Indian problem. And from the Congress side too, you see differences. Some would be willing to collaborate with the British and in return would be glad to receive the concessions that the government might offer to them. Others will be more insistent on a policy of confrontation. The Congress socialists, not interested in any kind of compromise with the British at a time when they thought a strike at the empire would actually bring independence. You have Bose and his followers who actually felt the same way. You have Nehru, who was ideologically committed to the fight against fascism, but who did not actually approve of the manner in which the British were actually deceiving the Indian politicians. Gandhi, on the other hand, had a kind of an ideological opposition against war itself by suggesting that one could possibly resist Germany by practicing non-violence. This was unrealistic. It actually carried a certain kind of commitment that Gandhi had to the principles of non-violence. You have such differences of opinion. But the situation after the outbreak of the war was such, largely because of the British compulsion of working with their allies, that they had to contemplate certain measures.
Sir, how did the British cabinet Visualize Indian cooperation.
Yeah. In the first place, there was an American pressure about which you are aware, that the Americans insisted on a declaration by the British regarding withdrawal from the colonies. And India was a testing ground for the British commitment to this ultimate vision of withdrawal from the colonies. I have already suggested that the more radically inclined British statesmen would actually consider the possibility of a dominion status. So some would say Britain would give India dominion status a year after the war would end. But others would not agree with this position. They would be happy or they would be content by ensuring a certain amount of consultation of Indian opinion in order to strengthen their war effort. I have already cited the example of Churchill. Churchill suggested that a war advisory board should be set up in which Indians should become associated, and through this war advisory board, the British would be able to consult Indian opinion regarding India's contribution to the war against Germany and the Axis powers. Linlithgow also had the same opinion. Linlithgow, the viceroy, also felt that the creation of a consultative body would solve the problem, at least for the time being, and he was in favor of deferring the discussion on constitutional changes. The Zetland, the Secretary of State, on the other hand, was actually contemplating a more positive measure to solve the Indian problem. But some kind of statement of intent on the part of the British was required by this constant American pressure. Yet, despite all this, the British, at this stage at least, never made their position on the dominion status for India clear. They were ambiguous. The Congress ministers resigned on the ground that before taking this decision to associate India in the war against the Axis powers, Indian opinion was never consulted. So it was on this ground ultimately the working committee of the Congress directed its governments to tender their resignation, which they did towards the close of 1939.
Sir, what impact did the resignation of the Congress ministry make on the British thinking about India?
I believe that this to some extent unnerved them. They realized that Congress had become somewhat alienated, and if they allowed this alienation to continue, then their war effort would suffer. So you see in early 1940, a relatively clear statement about dominion status in future, despite the opposition of Churchill and the Viceroy Linlithgow. But as I said, that during the 1940s, the war was actually playing a very critical role in shaping British opinion about what they were going to do with the Indian problem. So, middle of 1940, around May, June 1940, when Hitler's army was advancing towards England, towards Western Europe, Dunkirk fell, and some of the British statesmen and strategists were actually apprehending the complete fall of Europe. They felt that the time had come for them to think about India as a possible fallback option. That you have a huge army concentrated in the region on which the British could easily rely in order to continue the fight against the Axis powers from a more secure base in the Indian subcontinent if their resistance against Germany in Europe completely failed. So this kind of strategic option actually compelled them to contemplate draconian measures. The presence of a huge army would enable the government to impose their coercive measures more effectively, which they in fact did during 1942. But at the same time, as I said, that British opinion oscillated between these two poles. In August 1940, even a man like Linlithgow made an announcement which is known as the August Offer, in an attempt to avoid the conflict with the Congress. He promised that dominion status should be accorded to India within a year after the end of the war. The Constitution of India would be framed by a representative assembly. There will be special arrangements or agreements between Britain and India regarding British interests. But predictably, there were dissenting opinions. Not all of his peers or mentors agreed with his proposition, and ultimately the net result was the suggestion for an expansion of the War Advisory Council, as inclusion of Indians in some more Indians in the Viceroy's Council. There was a promise for dominion status after the war ended, but it fell short of the Congress expectation, because Congress in the meanwhile had already started talking about a national government, arguing that the Viceroy's Council should be expanded in such a way that it would create the basis of a national government by associating a larger number of Indians. And if defense of India was to receive this kind of priority in British policy, and Indians were to participate in this, then Indians must be associated with crucial decision making in the military and the defense department, something which the British government was not likely to concede. Even moderates like Tej Bahadur Sapru expressed their dissatisfaction with the way the British were actually treating Indian opinion, refusing to associate Indians in this. But once again, that the war was a major dynamic factor at this stage. It was the Southeast Asian War. The war extended to Southeast Asia. Japan overran a large part of the European colonial world in Southeast Asia. The INA had already emerged under Rajbihari Bose's leadership. So that was an opportune moment for some Labour members of the British cabinet, the war cabinet, to insist on a more positive policy towards India in order to avert a greater danger of Indians collaborating with the Japanese, as Japan was actually setting its eye on the Indian subcontinent. So this was the context in which Stafford Cripps, who had already earned a certain reputation as a pro-Indian parliamentarian, was sent to India with limited options, of course, even if he believed that ultimately the British government required to give India independence. No such mandate was given to Stafford Cripps. Stafford Cripps came with the promise of dominion status in future, but Stafford Cripps at the same time, in order to keep all the competing political groups together and reconcile to the idea that he was trying to propose, provided local options, a provision for local options, which is that if any of the provinces decided not to join the Union of India, the province would have the freedom to opt out. So that was one of the grave errors that Cripps had done by accepting in the process the idea of Pakistan. On the other hand, whatever might have been Cripps's intention, however much Cripps was actually aided by an American called Johnson in setting out a scheme for greater Indian involvement in the defense plan, the British government was not in a mood to concede. there was a proposal to form a kind of an expanded council, a kind of an interim government. The Congress insisted on control over the defense portfolio or the defense department. British government was not likely to relent, and in that situation there was another proposal that certain parts of the defense which were of vital importance should be retained with the military commander-in-chief. Wavell was the commander-in-chief at that time. Later on he would become the governor-general. So you have all these complications arising from a persistent resistance on the part of some of the British statesmen to the idea of greater involvement in crucial decision making that made eventually the Cripps proposals unworkable. And in any case, there was no possibility of setting up a national government during the war. The national government or the freedom that Indians were expecting was to come only after the war. So there ended the matter, and the day Cripps left India, sometime in the early part of July 1942, in a few weeks' time, that massive rebellion took place. Now, once the war ended, the British had to contemplate a few more new measures in order to solve this Indian problem. The need for post-war reconstruction demanded that kind of a strategy. So Wavell came up with the plan of involving Indians, equal number of congressmen and representatives of the League in a kind of a representative interim government. To achieve that objective, Wavell seriously tried to bring Gandhi and Jinnah to the negotiating table. All these Gandhi-Jinnah talks didn't succeed. Then you have the Simla Conference, 1945, June, July. Wavell arranged to sort out these problems that existed. The Simla Conference didn't succeed. It didn't succeed because Jinnah would not allow the Congress to choose a Muslim as a minister in the interim government. We are all familiar with the story of how from 1945-46 the Muslim League campaign in support of Pakistan began to gather strength, and Jinnah was banking on precisely on this claim in order to make the idea of Pakistan popular. But an interim government was the need of the hour, and some kind of constitutional measure which would actually provide a new basis of the Indian government as a dominion, strengthened by a representative assembly, by a constitution drafted and enacted by Indians themselves. All these Wavell and others felt absolutely necessary for British India. This was the context in which the British government decided to send the cabinet mission. There were 3 members in the cabinet mission: Pethick Lawrence, Alexander, and Cripps once again. And from March 1946, the cabinet mission carried on its work. Endless negotiations with the Muslim League, with the Congress leaders, their own negotiations with the bureaucracy. Now, what was this plan? The famous cabinet mission plan. It came up with the idea of a federal country. You have a union where the princes and the people of British India would join. Together they would create a constituent assembly. A constitution would be drafted. But at the same time, it visualized the 3-tier federal structure. The cabinet mission envisioned the creation of 3 different blocks of provinces. One was the Congress provinces, the Hindu majority; the other, the Muslim majority provinces of Western India, Punjab, Sindh, and the Northwestern Frontier province. And you have Muslim majority province, Assam and Bengal, another block, Group A, Group B, Group C, and each of these groups would have the option to move out of the group only after the Constituent Assembly has formulated a constitution. It doesn't actually give one the freedom to opt out entirely from the Union, but from the bloc. The Congress interpreted this cabinet mission plan as an attempt to balkanize India, felt threatened by the prospect of a weak center, unable to hold these blocks of provinces along with the princely states together. So Nehru, in a slip, suggested that they were waiting for the Constituent Assembly ultimately to deliberate on what should be the structure. The League took alarm. After accepting the cabinet mission plan, the League became so hostile to the Congress on this issue that on the question of joining the interim government, which the British were proposing at that time, they had continuous bickerings. And ultimately what happened, we know. The cabinet mission plan didn't succeed. The League eventually rejected it.
So what were the problems that were inherent in the cabinet mission plan?
From the Congress perspective, it actually threatened balkanization, at least to some congressmen. But even then, Congress was reconciled to the idea that ultimately this might succeed. Nehru, who was opposed to this view, ultimately accepted it. But they were always suspicious about the possibility of the League provinces seceding out of the Union, which was an improbable happening. Cabinet mission plan, on the other hand, was trying to bring the League and the Congress together under the rubric of a constitution, trying to bring them together through this very peculiar, complicated device. It was complicated, certainly, but it promised a good deal of provincial autonomy to different political interests. And the League had an interest in provincial autonomy. At least in some regions, the League had some amount of power. So the League was willing to accept it. But once that kind of an apprehension was created in their mind that eventually everything would be decided by the Constituent Assembly, by the majority vote, Jinnah became adamant. And then followed a very sordid history of continuous bickering, rejection of the mission plan and the decision to participate in the direct action. The sordid drama of high politics that set the stage for Indian independence and Indian partition. The British dream of solving the Indian problem by reconciling freedom with unity didn't succeed.